variety, and depth. Range, variety, and depth. Range, variety, and depth.
The equipment caption accounts for the equipment skill set of the performers. They do this by analyzing the written vocabulary and weighing the achievement of excellence relative to the challenges presented by the choreographic choices and efforts. When we assess the vocabulary, we do so by first looking at the written components or skills. One of the biggest measures of the vocabulary is the assessment of range, variety, and depth.
Range, variety, and depth.
Range, variety, and depth are an emphasis for this coming season. To better illustrate range, variety, and depth, let's use the concept of a color wheel, a pie chart for color. Most of you are familiar with the concept that three primary colors are mixed and blended to create secondary, tertiary, and ultimately a limitless number of hues covering the full spectrum of color. When we look at this color wheel with luminance, we see the hues varied by factors of saturation and light affecting the value of each hue. The more we vary each of these hues and then combine these hues further to create different colors, we're able to look at the wheel as a total of all color possibilities, comprised of immeasurable different individual colors, or hues. The same is true with assessing the equipment vocabulary. The total vocabulary represents the choices within all of the equipment possibilities and are made up of individual skills put into phrases to comprise the whole. What will be key to our conversation is imagining that each hue represents a family of skills, and the variables in saturation represent a variation of the standard skill for that family of skills. Let's take a closer look at one of these skill families.
Moves centered on displaying strength.
Standard tosses, a pretty common skill that all of us understand.
Standard tosses.
In tosses, we go from flips to singles and the halves and doubles, triples, quads, all the way up to rifle 8s and 9s and saber 12s and beyond. All possible variations of standard tosses are available on the wheel. Remember, the wheel represents all possibilities, not just the choices made to create the unit vocabulary. Anytime we display a skill, let's think of it as being a point on the wheel. When we throw a double, let's put a mark. Triple, put a mark, and so on. 5, put a mark. Now, take a second and remind yourselves that even an individual can display this skill, and its role in the total vocabulary is still noted. If a group displays the same skill, it's actually a different skill because of the necessary understanding of technique, training, timing, and uniformity that comes with multiples. It may be the same skill, but will be a separate achievement because of these factors. This is also true, say, if your rifle line through a standard quad, you would get a mark. And if your saber line then came behind them and displayed the same quad, then you would get another mark. This is because the implements are different, and the judge accommodates the understanding of the different set of principles because of the physical differences in the implements. This goes without saying. It is really obvious that a flag standard double is vastly different than a saber standard double, each one different and deserving of a separate acknowledgement of the skill displayed.
Identical skills displayed on separate implements are considered separate skills.
What I like to do when thinking about this is also create a space where skills have been heightened because of the variations around the expressive efforts of space,
Direct and indirect, close or extended,
time,
slow or sustained, through fast or quick,
weight,
light and soft, through forceful and strong,
and flow.
from free to bound.
The individual analysis captions have a heightened awareness of these expressive efforts and the dynamic range explored by the variations of these efforts.
Space, time, weight, and flow. Time, weight, and flow.
So in our example, if a standard triple was thrown and perhaps buzzed to affect its speed,
Changing speed creates a variation in time.
then that would be another skill noted. Or if the push from the right hand was intentionally diminished to create a lofty, slow triple, then these variations in time and ultimately flow and weight would be noted as separate skills. For today's purposes, let's make marks further from center when considering skills that have been affected by these efforts of space, time, weight, and flow.
Variations in expressive efforts create dynamic qualities.
As we continue, let's say you throw a quad from your knees and then catch standing. Even though the skill is built off of a standard quad, it is still a separate skill and worthy of acknowledgement. Let's say you jump during the catch, or you tilt for the release, or you change shape underneath the toss. With each of these variations, you're presenting yet another skill. Let's make sure we put a mark for each time we create a variation of this skill. This consideration of agility attached to the strength move of a toss is worthy of note and will also be placed a little further from center than the standard skill itself. Let's go back and look at what we have. As we explore the variations in this single skill,
Standard tosses.
we are finding our range for this skill. In this family or hue of standard tosses, these collection of points on our equipment wheel represent our range.
The ability to create variations within a single skill set. Range.
A quick word of caution to young instructors while considering range. Know that if you display the same skill in the same context in the same implement repeatedly without variation, your reward and acknowledgement of that skill are limited. In this wheel of equipment tool, there would be no additional marks as you repeatedly display the same skill, and you run the risk of diminishing your achievement of that skill by repeating these skills over a period of time. More on this later. Moving on, let's continue to look around the wheel. Let's remind ourselves that different skill set families will be represented by different colors or hues. This is limitless as well, but here are some common families of skills. As we observe skill families demonstrated and a range explored within these skill families, let's make a mark. As we look at the equipment wheel now, we see that we have marks placed around the wheel, showing that we've noted a skill in each skill family represented by a different hue. This distribution around the wheel, including the many families of skill, is what gives us our variety.
Variety.
This leaves us now with depth. Depth is a bit more difficult to discern because you have to consider depth in a couple of different ways. Let's look. Let's take a second and talk about skills and phrases again. Many times skills are combined not just closely through time, but actually blended and synthesized. In these cases, the components of the event or phrase combine to create a greater skill or phrase than the components considered separately. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
This happens with the combining of equipment skills as well as the blending of body and equipment. When the body and equipment combine, balance, centering, and manipulation of the equipment take on a whole new role as partnering between body and equipment evolves. In these times, the body and equipment will function in an equal and inseparable display of motion. In both instances, no component could be successful without the success of the other components of the event or phrase. For those more technically minded, the indicator of this might be the absence of recovery time if any component fails. This is where our two-dimensional wheel is not the most effective tool. Because these events and phrases transcend the compartmental skill sets of the wheel, let's put them in an area where the outside and inside meet in what might be a 3D model. Let's create a superzone. Operating in this superzone is an immediate indicator of depth, an outer ring of acknowledgement where placement is not necessarily relative to a single skill family. Now that we've accounted for these super events, let's talk about the first layer of depth. As we look back at the equipment wheel, we can now see the entirety of the wheel, or the entirety of the possibilities and the choices that create the vocabulary. Our first layer of depth is found by factoring both range, and variety while looking at the totality of the components that comprise the vocabulary.
The initial consideration of depth is factoring both range and variety while considering the total of the vocabulary's components.
We've already mentioned that in advanced phrasing, the frequency of skills over time is higher, creating more of an interdependence of the success of one skill to the next. This requires greater effort and understanding from the performers as recovery time is eliminated and the options for failure are gone. When operating at a fast pace over time, traveling at great distances, the performer is challenged through endurance. Proximity can also affect the value of events or phrases. In tight surroundings or crowded kinetic moments, the risk of proximity can be considered over time while assessing depth through external contexts. These external considerations impact the depth of the equipment vocabulary, not through the moves or the skills themselves that are factored independently, but the context or setting within which these skills are performed. These factors of depth are seen over time while assessing the entirety of the vocabulary.
Depth is found by factoring the total, range, and variety along with the challenges of context and setting over time. Depth.
We spent a great deal of time today talking about individual components and points of time. Make sure to understand that the assessment of the vocabulary and the achievement of that vocabulary is done by considering the entirety of the vocabulary, the totality of the time when equipment is used. Let me also remind us that today we spoke generally, across classes. Because of both points of development and points of view, each class will have its own separate and distinctive equipment wheel, where the number of skill sets displayed and the ranges within those skill sets vary from class to class, based on the expectation established by the class paradigm.
Range, variety, and depth.